Most wars last years. Some last decades. But one conflict stretched so long that entire kingdoms were born, collapsed, and were forgotten before it finally ended. It lasted longer than the Roman Empire ruled the West. Longer than the age of castles. Longer than many nations have even existed. This was not a war fought by one king, one army, or one generation. It was a struggle passed from father to son, from crown to crown, from century to century. And by the time it ended, the world had changed completely. This is the story of the Reconquista, often described as the longest war in history. But to understand it, we have to go back to the year 711. At that time, the Iberian Peninsula, the land we now know as Spain and Portugal, was ruled mostly by the Visigothic kingdom. It was a Christian kingdom, but it was politically divided, unstable, and vulnerable. Then, from North Africa, Muslim forces crossed the narrow waters near Gibraltar. Their commander was Tariq ibn Ziyad. Within a few years, most of the Iberian Peninsula had fallen under Muslim control. The region became known as al-Andalus. For many people living there, this was not the end of civilization. It was the beginning of a new world. Cities grew. Trade expanded. Arabic became a language of power and scholarship. Córdoba became one of the great cities of medieval Europe, famous for learning, architecture, libraries, and wealth. But in the rugged mountains of the north, small Christian communities remained. They did not have the power to reclaim the peninsula overnight. But they had something else. Memory. In the early 8th century, a small Christian force in Asturias resisted Muslim rule. The Battle of Covadonga, traditionally dated around 718 or 722, became a symbol of resistance. Historically, it may have been a small mountain battle. But symbolically, it became much bigger. It became the beginning of a story that would last for centuries. The early Christian kingdoms of the north were tiny compared to al-Andalus. They were poor, divided, and often fighting each other. Asturias, Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and later Portugal all had their own ambitions. This is one reason the Reconquista was never a simple war. It was not just Christians versus Muslims. It was also Christian kingdoms fighting Christian kingdoms. Muslim rulers fighting Muslim rivals. Alliances crossing religious lines. Cities changing hands. Borders moving slowly, painfully, and sometimes unpredictably. For centuries, war and peace existed side by side. A Christian king might fight a Muslim ruler one year, then ally with another Muslim ruler the next. Tribute, diplomacy, marriage politics, mercenaries, and betrayal all shaped the battlefield. The story was messy because real history is messy. Still, over time, the Christian kingdoms expanded south. One of the most famous figures of this age was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid. He was a warrior, mercenary, and legendary hero. But his life also shows how complex the period really was. El Cid fought for Christian rulers, but also served Muslim rulers when politics demanded it. He became a symbol of Spanish heroism later, but the real man lived in a world where loyalty was often more political than religious. Meanwhile, al-Andalus reached moments of extraordinary brilliance. In the 10th century, the Caliphate of Córdoba became one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in Europe. Its capital was filled with scholars, doctors, philosophers, poets, craftsmen, and merchants. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities lived under complex systems of rule, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in tension. This was not a dark age. It was a golden age for parts of Iberia. But power never stays still. In the early 11th century, the Caliphate of Córdoba collapsed into smaller Muslim kingdoms called taifas. These taifa kingdoms were culturally rich but politically divided. Their rivalries opened the door for Christian expansion from the north. Then came one of the great turning points. In 1085, the Christian kingdom of Castile captured Toledo. Toledo was not just a city. It was a symbol, a former Visigothic capital, a major center of learning, and a bridge between cultures. Its fall shocked the Muslim world and gave the Christian kingdoms a powerful foothold in central Iberia. But the story did not move in a straight line. Muslim dynasties from North Africa, first the Almoravids and later the Almohads, crossed into Iberia to stop Christian advances. They revived Muslim power and pushed back hard. For a time, the balance shifted again. Then, in 1212, came the Battle of las Navas de Tolosa. Christian forces from Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and others joined together against the Almohads. Their victory became one of the decisive moments of the Reconquista. After this, Muslim power in Iberia weakened dramatically. Over the next decades, major cities fell. Córdoba was captured by Christian forces in 1236. Valencia had already fallen earlier to El Cid, though control changed over time. Seville fell in 1248. By the late 13th century, only one major Muslim kingdom remained in Iberia, Granada. Granada survived because it was clever, wealthy, mountainous, and diplomatic. It paid tribute to Castile, played larger powers against each other, and used its geography for defense. For more than 2 centuries, Granada held on. Behind its walls rose the Alhambra, one of the most beautiful palace complexes ever built. Its courtyards, arches, inscriptions, gardens, and water channels became a final masterpiece of Islamic Spain. But Granada was also a kingdom living under pressure. By the late 15th century, Spain was changing. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united 2 powerful Christian crowns. Together, they turned their attention to Granada. The final war began in 1482. It was not one single battle. It was a grinding campaign of sieges, fortresses, negotiations, internal conflict, and exhaustion. Finally, on January 2, 1492, Granada surrendered. Its last Muslim ruler, Boabdil, handed over the keys to the city. The Reconquista was over. Depending on where you begin the story, it had lasted roughly 7.5 to nearly 8 centuries. A conflict so long that no one who saw its beginning lived anywhere near its end. But the end of the war did not mean the end of suffering. After 1492, Spain entered a new era of religious unity enforced by power. Jews were expelled that same year unless they converted. Muslims later faced forced conversion, pressure, rebellion, and expulsion. The Spanish Inquisition became part of this harsher world. The victory over Granada also happened in the same year Christopher Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic. That is one of history's strange connections. As the medieval frontier closed in Iberia, a new age of empire opened across the ocean. The Reconquista shaped Spain's identity, politics, religion, military culture, and imperial imagination. The language of holy war and conquest did not disappear. It traveled. But the human story is more complicated than victory and defeat. For centuries, Iberia was a place of war, yes, but also of exchange. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars preserved and translated ancient knowledge. Architecture, music, agriculture, medicine, philosophy, and language all crossed boundaries. Even after the armies moved on, the cultures remained inside each other. That is why the longest war ever is not just a story about battles. It is a story about memory. A war can end on paper. A city can surrender. A king can hand over keys. But the effects of centuries do not disappear in a single day. They remain in buildings, names, languages, borders, songs, myths, and wounds. The Reconquista lasted so long because it was never only about land. It was about identity. Who belonged? Who ruled? Whose God, whose law, whose memory would define the future? And that is why this war still matters. Not because we should see history as simple, but because we should remember how dangerous simple stories can become. The longest war ever was not one endless battle. It was centuries of shifting power, fragile alliances, broken promises, brilliant cities, ruined kingdoms, and people trying to survive between worlds. It began with an invasion across a narrow sea. It ended with keys handed over at Granada. And between those two moments, almost 800 years of human ambition, faith, fear, culture, and conflict reshaped the world. If this story changed the way you see history, like the video, and subscribe for more powerful stories from VeyrScope.